In this third and our last video, our focus turns to urban theory. What kind of urban theory is required for the urban global south? What theoretical tools can help us grapple with old and new challenges? How can we avoid perpetuating the othering inherent in categorizing theory for and from certain kinds of cities? Do we require new urban theory or the reworking of existing conceptualizations?
I would propose quite a different cartography for theorisation, in which we, of course, think about our locatedness or specificity of a city, that we're speaking from somewhere, that we recompose the subjects of theorising. But these localities, like cities, are dispersed wildly, circulating around the world as well, and have much to say to experiences and issues in other places. So cities are framed and constituted through an exteriority, a globalization, a worlding, many worldings, and in which case to think them through an archaic geopolitical spatial domain doesn't get us anywhere analytically.
The contemporary sense, I really find that, it's not so much a very specific sense of Southern theory, but really theories that are borrowed from so many different contexts. So, it's a patchwork quilt of different theorizations that actually helps you understand some of these discourses.
At the heart of the theory question is the issue of specificity, is the issue of unique conjunctions that happens in very particular places. We've got to find ways to combine that with a whole series of other knowledges that emerges from these places. And this would be knowledges embedded within the practices of urbanites as they're building the cities themselves. It's the knowledges that come from practitioners who's trying to make sense of that, working with citizens trying to deal with that condition. It's the knowledges of scholars who's trying to fulfill this bridging function between what is happening in these places, what urban actors are doing, what institutions are trying to regulate, and also what that may mean in a theoretical or philosophical register.
Theories, ideas, models that are in general circulation in the mainstream literature have not been very useful to planners working outside of that context. They're based on assumptions about society, about economy, about politics that don't hold. It would be very worrying if one was to start to repeat the mistakes of the past, which is to think that we can develop theory in the global south and then suggest that it is generalized to other parts that are very different.
I'm not sure whether we are in need of what you call a grand theory of the urban global south, and whether it would be possible to elaborate something like that, considering the many differences within the urban south.
I think on the one hand we're rightly suspicious of assumptions of sameness, of convergence, or of uniformity. But we are still, I think, tempted to seek safety in differences. But the trouble is that a reflex expectation of difference risks reproducing or reinstating absolute difference or otherness. As other scholars have observed, difference then becomes fetishized or essentialized. I don't think we should elevate difference to a kind of reflex principle of analysis, but be prepared to find difference and similarity or similarity. We need a theory that avoids what legal anthropologist Carol Greenhouse has called a moral geography of law and space, or what's also been called by geographer and urban planner Mark Purcell the local trap. That is an approach to theorisation which invests the local and community with a value that is denied the national, the state, or the global.
Theory which is required is a theory which does not simplify to the point of distortion. I'm not very fond of post-modern fragmentation or post-modern theoretical minimalism or post-modern denying of the necessity of theory. So A theory which preserves local, regional, and national peculiarities without denying the existence of commonalities. I would not like to say universal level, but at a global level.
I don't think that we necessarily need new urban theories, but we need to understand that urban theories are imperfect in as far as they treat or portray the urban global south as imperfect. Again, this treatment of the urban global south as imperfect, incomplete, attributed the lack of the poor, the weak, is something that theory does very often, and of course again we have to question what are the hegemonic frameworks of explanation, the hegemonic explanans that we are using to come to the conclusions about what is lacking here.
For me, it's a wrong question. We shouldn't be asking, do we need a southern urban theory? What we should be doing is we should be saying, why do we need theory at all? What's the role of theory? And once we've addressed that question, then you can say, what's the role of theory for the kinds of places that we're working in? And for me, the role of theory is that it gives you a moral compass, and it helps you get conceptual clarity, and it facilitates comparison across places, because you're asking questions where you at least have some sense that you are engaged in a similar debate. So it abstracts, and so I think theory in that sense is really important. And if you think about what's going on and what characterizes our knowledge of the global south, it's precisely that it's fuzzy, that it's murky, that we don't really know what's going on, that we're actually not even really sure that when we act that we're doing the right thing. So if you, in those terms, then I think yes, definitely we need theory. Do we need theory that speaks well to those places and contexts? Absolutely. If that means that we have to revise the theoretical questions that we're asking, or rethink and reframe them on the basis of evidence from other places, then that for me is what constitutes southern theory.
We need to remind ourselves that all theories come packaged with specific subjectivities and positionalities that are instantiated in addition to the power relations that emerge in all social research. For example, terms like the economy, workers, shack dwellers, the poor, all come out of specific theoretical frameworks that instantiate well-rehearsed identities. If we are to generate new knowledge, we need to get beyond these rehearsals of these identities. This means that planners need to adopt or look for new epistemologies and methodologies to generate new knowledge. And on this basis, if we're going to generate any new theories, we need to think about these epistemologies and methodologies.
It's important to understand that certain types of conceptualizing are useful for practice and some of it really isn't. And each of us personally makes that choice in certain ways, but I think it's perhaps not surprising that a lot of theorizing going on about the global urban south is done by folks who are not involved with practice.
New realities have evolved, new systems have evolved, new laws have been put into place. Old laws, many of them good laws for the poor, have been abandoned in the last decade and a half. I think these are the new realities, and I don't think we have paid enough attention to them. So I don't think we can have a theory.
But cities are very complex, self-organizing systems, and especially when they're growing so quickly. In a world that's changing so rapidly, in some senses, the only thing that's constant is good theory, because the practice is always moving.
We need to recognize, as in the case of planning, that theory itself is not only dominated by northern experience and practice and scholars, but the whole of academia, the political economy of academia, is northern dominated. And hence, this might be another reason for a coalition, a South-South coalition, in order to generate, transform, and develop views from the so-called South.
The relationship between institutions in the South is through institutions in the North. I think that has to change, because unless that changes, the negotiation, the discussion is through proxy. And I think that distorts the debate considerably. I think there has to be a South-South dialogue.
I mean, it may be that it's, you know, if it comes from the North, it's more likely to be seen as theory, and if it comes from the South, it's more likely to be seen as kind of practical knowledge or connection.
The opportunities for learning from quite different cities are quite strong. So if we segment off, for example, understandings of informality as a dynamic, emergent form of social relationships in cities, which emerge out of the condition of being urban, we segment those off into the South or Africa or Asia, then we have not the lens to look perhaps at informality as it emerges in European cities. And as Patrick Legalis has been arguing, there's much about all cities which is ungovernable, which is emergent and unknowable. So in fact, we can learn much by thinking across different kinds of contexts in interesting, surprising ways. So I'm looking for an analytic which allows us to compose understandings across quite different kinds of cities and to recognize those differentiations, but to see the opportunities to work across them in more agile ways. So the spatialities of theorizing would be much more complicated.
The theoretical dialogue between the so-called urban global north and urban global south is still very much dominated by theoretical frameworks that originate from the north. The example of the neoliberal city or neoliberal urban development is very, very typical of that, for instance. And you have still very few attempts to reverse that balance, if you want, to, for instance, look at urban processes taking place in the north, but through what would be normally considered a southern lens. So there is some example, for instance, of thinking about informal processes of governance, informal processes shaping urban development, planning and practices in the north, but they are very much on the margins. There is nonetheless, I think, some very interesting dialogue, emerging dialogue between theories emanating from the north that tend to try and identify what is specific amongst sort of broad structuring trends, broad structuring globalization trends, if you want, and literature coming from the south that also identifies the specificities of the urban global south by focusing specifically on the everyday life, unpacking what it means, this everyday life perspective on cities of the south.
What that calls is clearly for a decenter of those, hegemonic explanations. And that cannot be done in any other way, but by thinking through network understandings. And again, this takes us back to this idea of hegemony and hierarchy. The hegemonic way in which knowledge is produced and knowledge the urban global south is talked about is all over the place, is in front of us.
The north-south argument that the north is, creating your theories and the south is not being listened to, it's maybe true in some aspects, but definitely not true in all aspects. The center of gravity of global economy is shifting. And in this new reverse flow, I have a feeling that is ultimately going to influence the intellectual content of what we work on.